Barely any occasions in current history are as pivotal as the blast at Unit 4 of the Chernobyl atomic power plant on April 26, 1986. In any case, even as blazes overwhelmed the structure and the harmed reactor regurgitated unfathomable degrees of radiation over the farmland, few knew the size of the catastrophe. The reaction was, therefore, remiss. The Soviets didn't promptly understand that they were managing the most noticeably terrible atomic fiasco in mankind's history. For what reason did it take such a long time for unequivocal activity to arrive? What caused the emergency, in any case? In these flickers, you'll find the appropriate responses. Here, you'll gain inside the power room as the allegorical doomsday clock ticked down to midnight. Get some answers concerning the endeavors to forestall further disaster, and find out about the gallant spirits who relinquished their well-being to tidy up the pollution. There's likewise a political aspect to the failure, with the Soviet Union as of now in a spiral, being managed a devastating hit to its authenticity. Different reactors at Chernobyl might have been back going after the mishap they were at last decommissioned in 2000, yet the USSR itself couldn't recuperate from the impacts of 1986. Just before the blast, Chernobyl laborers were leading a safety test. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Soviet Ukraine was the third most dominant on Earth in 1986. To suit its military of laborers, experts developed the city of Pripyat 2 kilometers from the plant. Clamoring with a populace of 45,000, life in this atomic town was rich by Soviet measures. Meat and dairy were accessible in shops, and it flaunted 2 pools and an ice arena. This pure scene was broken after April 26th, when a progression of blasts tore through Chernobyl's Unit 4, home to its 4th atomic reactor. To truly get a handle on the extent of this debacle, it's useful to see how atomic reactors work. Most importantly, they exist to make heat. This warmth vaporizes water into steam, controlling turbines to create power. They make heat through a procedure called parting. Splitting is the point at which the core of atom parts into littler segments. At the point when splitting happens, vitality and modest subatomic particles called neutrons are discharged. We can prompt parting by compelling a neutron to slam into another particle's core. However, we can't do this without a stockpile of neutrons that have just been liberated from their unique molecule. The cores of certain particles, like uranium-235, are very insecure. They normally need to experience splitting to enable them to part into littler, increasingly stable parts. This characteristic parting can begin a chain response, with liberated neutrons crashing into different molecules, parting them and discharging more neutrons. Pressing uranium-235 particles near one another in fuel bars makes only this sort of chain response. However, there's an issue. Neutrons travel so quickly that they're probably not going to hit other uranium iotas to back them off, and in this manner increment reactivity. Atomic plants use substances like water and graphite. To control the intensity of the response, atomic plants likewise have control poles, made of materials like boron, which retain neutrons. These are embedded into the reactor's center, and modifying the profundity of the control bars manages the intensity of the response. In the interim, cooling liquid flows through the reactor itself, directing its general temperature. Anyway, what occurred inside Unit 4 on April 26th? All things considered, staggeringly, administrators were directing a well-being test on this very framework. So, if Chernobyl at any point encountered a power loss, electricity was as yet required to siphon the cooling liquid into the reactor to prevent it from overheating. Diesel generators were close by for this, however. They took 45 seconds to kick in a perilous deferral. In any case, Chernobyl's steam turbines didn't promptly stop after a power misfortune, so it was conceivable that their perishing pivots would create enough power to connect the 45-second hole before influence was re-established. The test planned to affirm this. Fumble and inadequacy drove Unit 4's reactor to the verge of disaster. Unit 4's turbine test was a dangerous variety of bumbles and mishap. At 4 p.m. on Friday, April 24th, the night move, driven by Yuri Tregub, dominated. Tregub was curious about with the system for the test, so he called his prevalent, who dispatched the severe vice president engineer, Anatoly Dyatlov. At 10 p.m., Unit 4 got the green light from Kyiv to start the test. However, Dyatlov had halted at Unit 3 to train administrators. He didn't touch base until 11 p.m. and afterward expelled Tregub's inquiries concerning the shutdown technique, requesting the test to start in any case. By midnight, Tregub had decreased Unit 4's yield to 760 megawatts warm, MWT, as was required for the test. As of now, the youthful and unpracticed individuals from the night move dominated, including shift pioneer Alexander Akimov and Leonid Toptunov. The laborers were ill-equipped, yet Dyatlov still rebuked them for working gradually. As they started working with the control poles, however, a shortcoming made power in the reactor tumble. By 12:28 a.m., it was producing only 30 MWT. They started evacuating control poles, and the temperature began to rise, however. The inquiry remained. Would it be a good idea for them to close down the reactor, or continue and complete the test? Dyatlov resolved to proceed, requested the ability to be raised to 200 MW, far lower than the required 760 MWT. Supporting even 200 MWT demonstrated troublesome, however. With the reactor working at low control for such a long time, responses in the fuel poles had eased back. To keep control at 200 MWE, Toptunov continued expelling control poles. Just 9 out of 167 stayed in the reactor by 1:22 a.m. As of now, the reactor's water-based cooling framework bubbled into steam, and the rising temperature kicked the fuel bars once again enthusiastically. There was a colossal spike in power, and the response spiraled wild. At 1:23 a.m., Toptunov squeezed the AZ-5 catch, which enacted a crisis shutdown technique that quickly embedded all the control bars. Yet, rather than closing down the response, Arizona 5 set off a progression of gigantic blasts that tore through the reactor and turbine corridors of Unit 4. Soviet-made RBMK reactors contained a lethal structure defect. In this way, the prompt trigger for the Chernobyl blasts was the actuation of the AZ-5 crisis security measure which should have quickly slaughtered the response. Be that as it may, why? All things considered, Chernobyl isn't only an account of human blunder. Another factor was there, a design defect. Chernobyl's atomic reactors were a specific Soviet type called high-power channel reactors, RBMK. Most atomic plants use water to cool their reactors, and furthermore as a mediator, a substance that builds reactivity by backing neutrons off inside the center. Be that as it may, RBMK reactors use graphite as a mediator rather, which is less protected. Furthermore, Chernobyl's reactors even utilized graphite on the tips of their control poles. This was the plan blemish. For what reason would a reactivity-diminishing control bar be tipped with a reactivity-expanding material? All things considered, it was a horrible structured decision. Be that as it may, these graphite tips weren't intended to be expelled from the reactor in RBMK reactors. A completely withdrawn control pole still had its graphite tips sitting inside the reactor. The reactor's planners figured this would permit administrators more power over the response. Be that as it may, at Chernobyl on April 26th, the control pole's tips were outside the center when Toptonov squeezed AZ-5. In this way, when the control poles moved into the center, the principal material embedded was reactivity-expanding graphite. With the reactor as of now in an incredibly unsteady condition, the presentation of this graphite pushed it over the edge. All water was in a split second vaporized into steam, substantially an excessive amount, to vent right away. It caused a blast, sending the 200-ton solid shield of the reactor through the top of Unit 4. What's more, without any water in the cooling funnels, the center superheated, burst into flames, and caused a second, considerably increased, amazing blast. This devastated the reactor's regulation structure and dissipated profoundly radioactive graphite over the power plant. Be that as it may, for what reason did Soviet specialists create RBMK reactors as opposed to utilizing the other, more secure options prominent in the West? There were a few reasons. For a certain something, RBMK reactors are considerably more dominant than ordinary Western reactors, ready to create double the vitality. They're likewise less expensive, utilizing just somewhat improved uranium as fuel. Most alarming of all, however, they can be immediately changed over into plutonium-delivering plants, the key substance for atomic weapons. With their plan blemishes, RBMK reactors were a ticking time bomb that at long last exploded on April 26th. Be that as it may, all things being equal, the Soviet reaction was not quick. Obliviousness and disavowal portrayed the underlying outcome of the blast. The specialized military fire department was brought in following the blasts. What they found stunned them. Pockets of flame all over the place, and Unit 4's reactor corridor in remains. Fire on the rooftop was the underlying issue. Wearing only standard defensive apparatus, the firemen's boots began softening from the outrageous radioactive warmth. On the rooftop, they saw shiny pieces of shake that precipitously burst into blazes. To forestall the flames spreading, they kicked them to the ground. No one had told the firemen, yet these stones were bits of graphite from Unit 4's reactor center, discharging an unimaginable measure of lethal radiation. Before long, the firemen started to feel unwell. They all griped of cerebral pains, a metallic preference for their mouths, dry throats, and extraordinary queasiness. It wasn't long until they were regurgitating. One fireman, Peter Chavray, expelled metal flotsam and jetsam from the fields, burnt out on a fire engine, with his uncovered hands, the skin quickly stripped off them. For what reason were these firemen sent into the world's most harmful zone with no assurance or cautioning, as a result of the experts' stunning blend of numbness and forswearing? In the pivotal hours after the blast, plant laborers didn't educate specialists that the reactor was harmed because they wouldn't trust it had detonated. Those in the control room, Dyatlov and Akimov especially, essentially accepted that the turbine corridor was harmed. Indeed, even as plant laborers vomited from radiation affliction, most just ascribed it to stun. And keeping in mind that these laborers were blinded by mistrust, different specialists brandished their very own image of refusal. One such figure was Viktor Bryukhanov, executive of the power plant and a senior regulatory figure in the laborers' city of Pripyat. As opposed to keeping an eye on the circumstance, he drafted an update to party pioneers in Kyiv, just expressing that the top of Unit 4's reactor corridor was harmed. In that notice, Bryukhanov additionally recorded Chernobyl's radiation level as 1,000 miniaturized scale Roentgen for every second. In any case, their apportioning hardware maxed at this figure, and he realized that, rather than expressing that radiation levels were off the diagrams, he recorded the off-base figure he had. Notwithstanding, when a subordinate with better gear revealed to Bryukhanov he'd gauged 55,000 miniaturized scale Roentgen, he forgot about him. With people on call progressively wiped out, this condition of disavowal didn't keep going long, however. It did keep going long enough to destroy numerous lives unnecessarily. At last, understanding the calamity's extent, authorities and researchers chipping away at harm impediments. Radiation affliction is a savage killer. One kind of radiation, ionizing radiation, isolates electrons from their particles. This slaughters living cells or makes them glitch. Individuals presented to high portions of ionizing radiation will create intense radiation disorder, ARS. In extreme cases, patients experience the runs, skin consumes, and sensory system disappointment. Experts couldn't deny or make light of the debacle when firemen and plant laborers landed at Pripyat Emergency Clinic showing ARS side effects. The reactor had been harmed, and this was a disaster. Be that as it may, all things being equal, Pripyat wasn't cleared. The day after the calamity, with radioactive fiery debris heaving into the sky, Pripyat occupants knew nothing. Why? Since neighborhood experts sat tight for directions from gathering managers, they would not like to make a frenzy. Significant activity didn't land until a state commission, driven by the curt lawmaker Boris Sherbina, arrived. An entire 36 hours after the blast, the commission's boss logical guide Valery Legasov persuaded Sherbina to empty Pripyat. Occupants were told this was brief, yet no one saw home once more. With departure in progress, the inquiry remained. How were they going to tame the reactor? It was as yet ablaze and burping out radioactive particles. The Commission requested helicopters to drop 5,000 tons of sand, lead, earth, and boron onto the reactor. In any case, numerous pilots lost their lives floating over this atomic inferno. In the interim, nobody recognized what was going on inside the reactor, or whether this was making a difference. Every airdrop made a little blast, spreading radioactive material into the air. However, Legasov dreaded an all the more dominant blast may come. That the superheated reactor may torch to the storm cellar, where 20,000 tons of radioactive water lay, and cause another steam blast. To fix this, 3 designers dove into the overflowed underground passageways. They coordinated water into regulation chambers, where it was siphoned out by firemen. Next, the Commission stressed that the reactor may torch its way to the water table, spreading into the Dnieper River basin and inevitably polluting the world's seas. So 380 excavators burrowed another chamber underneath the reactor. Inside this, manufacturers developed a defensive, solid stage. Nobody knows what number of lives these endeavors cost. More regrettable, nobody knows whether they were even vital. Be that as it may, we do realize that further fiascos on a mainland scale didn't happen. These measures were taken. The time had come to start the cleanup. Further peril deflected, the Soviet government started a tremendous cleanup activity. Sherbina's commission sorted out maybe the biggest cleanup activity ever, with the most exceedingly terrible finished. Chernobyl and its encompassing region were incredibly defiled, and winds were conveying radioactive particles far further. An atomic power station in Sweden, 1,200 kilometers away, distinguished Chernobyl's radiation. Or, at long last, mindful of the circumstances' extent, Soviet high authorities called upon their tremendous hold of HR, gathering more than 600,000 warriors, researchers, engineers, and talented laborers to Chernobyl. These individuals, known as outlets, sterilized a great many square kilometers of the region. They were given sparse data and no defensive dress. Inside a 30-kilometer avoidance zone around Chernobyl, helicopter pilots spread a fluid substance that constrained radioactive residue to attach to surfaces. On the ground, troops showered a cleaning arrangement on each conceivable surface. Specialists led controlled tear-downs of structures and covered them in solid pits alongside autos, cranes, and PCs. Fighters shot and buried debased felines, pooches, and chickens as well. They likewise destroyed and covered the Red Forest, a territory of pine trees turned ginger dark, colored by radiation content or ingestion. The most nerve-wracking and brave act, however, included the expulsion of radioactive graphite from the top of Unit 3. After endeavoring to do this with robots, just for their circuit sheets to be harmed from the radiation, biorobots, that is, people cleared the rooftop physically. Clad with respirators and lead defensive rigging, 3,000 troopers scooped graphite from the rooftop, hurling it into the reactor corridor beneath. Due to the extraordinary radiation, these biorobots worked one-off movements, enduring minor seconds. At this point, it was mid-May, and the primary casualties of ARS started to pass on. The carcasses of these firefighters and plant administrators were enclosed by plastic sacks and set in caskets. These boxes were additionally enveloped by plastic, set in zinc coffins, and brought down into profound graves secured by bond tiles. A quarter of a year after the mishap, 28 individuals had been covered along these lines. The last advance was the development of a monster, 400,000-ton solid stone coffin encasing Unit 4's reactor. In any case, before this could start, 80,000 laborers developed a 6-meter-thick solid divider around Unit 4's whole site, permitting some type of assurance for solid pourers chipping away at the stone coffin. It was at last finished in late November, with 200,000 specialists working on the task. They worked in the most sullied zone of the most debased zone on Earth. The social and natural expenses of Chernobyl were enormous. It's difficult to get a handle on the colossal results of Chernobyl, yet 2 quick classifications can enable us to fold our heads over everything: the ecological effect and the human expense. As 2, the official Soviet loss of life of 31 is as yet perceived in Russia today. Be that as it may, this figure just checks those killed by the impact or from ARS in the months after, and is generally challenged. A few researchers gauge that 50 individuals passed away because of ARS, and a lot more may at present bite the dust of radiation introduction later on. Besides, these figures don't represent those whose lives have been or will be stopped by malignancy, expedited by the introduction to high dosages of Chernobyl's radiation. As indicated by Vyacheslav Grishin of the Chernobyl Union, a promotion bunch for previous outlets, around 60,000 vendors have as of now passed on, and 165,000 are for all time incapacitated. A few assessments for the long-haul loss of life keep running as high as 93,000. In the 5 years after Chernobyl, youngster malignant growth rates in Ukraine expanded by 90%. Additionally, in 2005, more than 19,000 Ukrainian families got government help due to a family deprivation decided to be identified with the catastrophe. Chernobyl likewise prompted the detainment of 6 plant administrators and well-being authorities, including 10-year work camp sentences for plant supervisor Viktor Bryukhanov, boss designer Nikolai Fomin, and representative architect Anatoly Dyatlov. The suicide of the administration commission's boss, logical guide Valery Legasov, is another dark stain. Legasov infuriated Soviet authorities by including insights regarding RBMK reactor plan in his report to the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna. Even though he adhered to the partisan loyalty and censured workforce for the disaster, disclosing Soviet atomic plan mysteries was unsatisfactory. He was denied a Soviet honor for his administration at Chernobyl, and in 1987, his partners disregarded him for advancement to the overseeing body of the USSR Academy of Sciences. 2 years after Chernobyl, Legasov hung himself. What are more, Chernobyl's outcomes were likewise natural. In general, the blast discharged radiation proportionate to 500 Hiroshima bombs into the environment, sullying 100,000 square kilometers of Eastern Europe. Inside this polluted zone was the Ukrainian area of Narodaichi. In 1988, movie producer Yuri Shkerbak delivered a narrative about a Narodaichi ranch. It demonstrated that, in the year following the mishap, more than 63 creatures were brought into the world disfigured. In any case, the effects of Chernobyl weren't simply social and natural, they were political as well. The Chernobyl fiasco added to the defeat of the Soviet framework. It's anything but difficult to focus on the human and ecological effects of Chernobyl, given their immense degree and awful nature. That'd be a misstep, however, because the debacle additionally assumed a key job in one of the 20th century's most earth-shattering political breaks. Chernobyl catalyzed the breakdown of the Soviet Union in 1991. Once out of office, Mikhail Gorbachev even composed that the emergency was the genuine reason of the USSR's end. Chernobyl lethally undermined the Open's now faltering trust in the Soviet government. This was particularly valid for the Soviet republics of Ukraine, Belarus, and Lithuania. Exploiting Gorbachev's unwinding of restriction laws in 1986, creators and activists condemned the administration's treatment of the calamity and advanced its outcomes. Writers like Alla Yaroshinskaya ventured to every part of the Ukrainian farmland and gave an account of tainting and well-being dangers. In the Narodaichi area, she found that 80% of youngsters had extended thyroid organs, an unmistakable indication of high radiation introduction. Different journalists guaranteed that the administration was lying about the degree of sullying because they would not like to obstruct the development of new atomic plants. With government analysis mounting and the economy in free fall, Gorbachev attempted to support for the legislature by presenting without semi-decisions in 1988. In any case, this simply compounded the situation by opening the entryway to disagree. Stirred by ecological and medical problems, residents in Ukraine and Belarus were transparently showing against socialist experts by 1989. On September 30th, a horde of 30,000 accumulated in Minsk to tune in to the Belarusian Popular Front, a gathering of eco-activists. In 1990, decisions were held for the new Congress of People's Deputies. In a few Soviet republics, constituents chose representatives who related themselves with national freedom and denuclearization. In March, Lithuania pronounced autonomy, and Gorbachev forced a financial bar on the nation. Things were spiraling wild. In August 1991, fair delegates inside the Ukrainian parliament announced autonomy from the Soviet Union, subject to an open choice. The lawmaker who read the presentation was Volodymyr Yavorivsky, leader of a commission concentrating the outcomes of Chernobyl. The freedom choice, hung on December 11, 1991, brought about a staggering yes. After 9 days, the Soviet Union was broken up. The USSR may have been bound to the dustbin of history in 1991, however. The impacts of the calamity at Chernobyl in 1986 will be felt for ages.